Again, I want to welcome everybody as people are still coming in here. Thank you for joining us. And Chris mentioned this earlier, that we rescheduled, in part, we rescheduled because of the George Floyd killing that had happened and the uprisings that had been happening in the Twin Cities were impacting us all in various ways, and wanted to honor and respect how that was impacting people. So wanted to reschedule, and also at this point, I also want to acknowledge where we are, and that many of us are able to show up here today without having to have the extra feelings that are necessarily coming along with losing someone in a way such as George Floyd's family lost him. And so thank you for joining us here today now. And as I mentioned, and I know people are continuing to come in here, we are here to talk about facilitating student engagement in synchronous Zoom sessions. And so this has become a lot more prominent with the coronavirus, and thinking about what's going to be happening in the fall, which is still sort of a unknown, or pick your own, choose your own adventure type thing. And we know that with Zoom sessions, it's kind of hard to read the room. And so we're going to give you some ideas and some suggestions for ways to sort of coach your students in doing better with that. We are going to be exploring different technologies within Zoom and a couple outside of Zoom. So those of you that feel like you're just barely handling Zoom, that's okay too. But for those of you that want a little bit more advanced features, we're going to throw some things at you toward the end as well that you can dive into. Again, we're going to encourage you to use the chat feature if you have ideas or things as we're going through stuff. But I'm just going to point out our guiding assumptions for this workshop is that you've already decided to use Zoom for synchronous sessions, or you're trying to decide if this is what you're going to do, and this session may help you do that. We know that you want to engage with your students, so it's not just going to be a live lecture of the sort. You want some sort of engagement, and you'd like to get your students to engage with each other, build a little bit more class community. And you're here looking for strategies to do that. We're not going to claim to have all of the strategies that you could possibly use, but we have some ideas to get you going, and feel free to share more. So again, it's not just about what we know or what we share. And if you have other ideas of how you're using things, please feel free to share that along the way. All right, so orienting to Zoom. I see lots of people with just their names on here that don't have pictures. So to me, that indicates that you might be relatively new to using Zoom. And so we just want to make sure we have this orientation to Zoom so you know a few things. One, when you move your mouse around right now, you should see, I see it on the bottom half, you might see it at the top half of where there's a chat. This is where you can ask questions. So find your chat feature. If you click on that, it might pop up to the side a little bit, and you should be able to press the escape key. Actually, we'll get to this too. The escape key will help you kind of bring all of that back together where I'm presenting and the chat feature. If you press the participants panel, this is where you can also raise your hand, and the mute and unmute shows up all around where your controls are, depending on how they show up. And so you can click on the raise your hand feature that lets us know you have a question or you have something to say. Depending on the size of the class, this may be something that you want to use so people aren't talking over each other. And then we also, if you're not seeing all of the slides, there is a fit to window screen control that you can choose as well. And so that's just one of the things that to point out there. Now, to practice using Zoom, and one of the things that you can also do in your class, we're going to start off with introductions. And so for introductions, we're just going to have you put some stuff in the chat. Your name should show up in the chat when you do that. So, oops, went too far, sorry. You're introducing yourself in the chat. So what you teach, and then the size of the class. And if you're brand new to Zoom, you can let us know that too, if you're willing to throw yourself out there to that, or yeah, what your experience is. So what you teach, you know, are you upper level, lower level class, and are you teaching large classes, small classes, is kind of what we're trying to understand as well. So we have a range of topics and content people are covering with our students.
And one of the things you're going to note is that I'm not going to comment on every comment, and I'm also not going to comment too quickly. And that's one of the things that you can do to encourage participation with your students. If you respond to the first like 2 or 3 chats that come in, people stop writing in the chat. So you really do want to give wait time to allow people to think and have time, and not expect that you're waiting for the first 2 people to respond. This is a similar dynamic to your in-person class, where if you respond to the first person who raises their hand every time, only the first 5 to raise their hand ever participate. Sarah, what I'm noticing in the chat, maybe you're seeing the same thing, is most people are teaching around 20 to 40 students, with a few people with particularly small classes and a few people with some larger classes, but around that kind of middling number to me.
Great. Perfect for groups and breakout discussions. You do that with the large groups too, but good sizes for that. Okay, now we're going to try something that's going to get a little wild, I imagine, because we have so many people here. So we're gonna try to push that middle ground. Maybe something that's going to be easier to do when you do have the 25 mark of students. Probably wouldn't want to do this with your 150, but we're going to try it with 56 to see how you go. How this works. What we're going to do is I'm going to share a whiteboard. And I'll show the screen here. And on the whiteboard, I haven't done it yet, so don't go try to do it yet. If you're putting this in chat, we're going to have you do this on the whiteboard. I'm going to share something that's called the whiteboard within Zoom, and it allows for anyone to go and type things in. There's, you can draw things, but there's also a text box. And so you're going to create a text box of what you're hoping that we'll address today. And this, you may end up typing on top of each other, and that's going to be okay right now. The view options for your instructions for annotating are going to be at the top. You can choose different colors, and wherever you place your cursor is where you're going to start typing with your text once that comes in here. So I
might encourage you to pick a different color than the default. Otherwise, as we type on top of each other, it's not going to work. But again, this is for you to see how this works, for us to get a sense of what some of the questions are, and then for you to imagine how this might work in a class that's probably closer to 15 or 20 participants. So here you're going to go view options at the top, click annotate.
I see it, like I could see a text. I'm typing my name, but I don't want you to do that. I want you to tell us what you're hoping to, what we're hoping to address today.
Yeah, so Clara, you're just going to go up to the top and type view and click that view options, find the annotate selection, and that will open up the panel that you're seeing on Sarah's. So you can click the text, and then you can type a question that you are hoping to have addressed today on the whiteboard. Or if you're seeing one that you like, you can always just draw a little star next to it. So now we're getting to the part where it gets tricky.
You can, I believe, move your, if you use the select button, I believe you can move yours around. Oh, if you looks at, I can move others around. I'm not sure if that's because I'm a host or if you
because you're the host
can also do it too, but I think you can, there's a select button that you can move some around so you can see more of them. Of course, that means I may have just moved away from starred things. I need to not starve. Now, I have a question. Does anybody have the answers of how to get students to not zone out in a face-to-face class? Because we are going to work on that, like that, as we are offering suggestions, but I'm just also know that that can happen almost, that not necessarily just as easily, depending on the students, but that can also happen in face-to-face. So
Perfect. So we're seeing a few different questions. We are hoping to address a number of these, motivating students, trying to encourage active participation, how to help students not zone out. And then the other thing too, as you're working, is that you may want to just rely on a lot of your the techniques that you use for your in-class teaching, and a lot of those port over really well. And so we'll show you some ways to make that work a little bit as well.
Yep. For some of you who are having difficulties, I'm not sure if it has to do with the authentication coming in, or if there was a whiteboard that you just weren't seeing, depending on if you were on an iPad versus a phone versus a computer. There could be some issues with that too. So,
and Sarah, before you go back, can you just quick save that whiteboard and then switch over?
Yes, save this whiteboard.
Thank you.
All right, whiteboard saved. New share, back to this. Here we are. All right. So our goals for educational settings, and this is somehow I got the whiteboard on there. So our goals for educational settings, this is face-to-face or online, is to engage students with the content, engage students with the instructor, and engage students with each other. And so this is just generally one of the things that we're, three of the things that we're always trying to do when we're in an educational setting, is getting students to engage with all those three things, because that's part of what helps learning happen. As for our agenda today, we've already started off and experimented with a few things, but we're going to move on to asking student questions. And then we're going to talk a bit about encouraging student participation, and we're going to break out into a small group and looking at facilitating small group work, and then have a quick wrap up. And so what we're also going to do now is I'm moving over here, and Chris is going to take over, and she's going to remote control into my screen, and we will see how well that keeps working.
Yeah, there we go. Awesome. I'm gonna just go back a slide. Great. So we're gonna start with kind of thinking about asking students questions. So in our in-person, since all of your classes are structured a little bit differently, what we're gonna do is show you a bunch of different things and hope that you find some ideas that stick for your context and content, and take what speaks to you and leave what doesn't. And so first we wanna turn to how you can ask students questions and ask ways for them to respond in a Zoom setting. And just like in your in-person classes, you want to be intentional about how you structure your questions and encourage all students to engage in your class. And so for quick questions or spontaneous questions, chat, or having students raise their hand and unmute themselves can make a lot of sense. So guide students to put themselves into gallery view when you are in what I usually call the Brady Bunch view, but of course that is generationally becoming dated. The gallery view, when students raise their hands or use those reaction buttons that are in the bottom of your participants panel, those show up on their pictures. So if you haven't tried those out, if they raise their hand and you've got them in gallery view, literally there's a hand that goes on top of their picture. If they put a thumbs up, you can see the thumbs up on the top of their picture, and that can be really helpful. But as I mentioned before, likely if you just do chat or just do raise your hand, you'll end up with a scenario that often happens in our in-person teaching, where only a few people respond and you start to get to know them, and those same 5 to 10 people are the same 5 to 10 to respond to any question throughout the semester. So in order to overcome this, we'd like you to think about how you can leverage some of the basic tools to engage the whole class as well. Yes, and when we're sharing the screen, you can't be in gallery view and share the screen at the same time. And so that's one of the trade-offs of sharing your screen. And then Catherine asks a question about raising hands. One of the things that happens when students raise their hand is that in your participants panel as the host, everybody who raises their hand moves to the top. So if you've got more people, so right now I can only see 5 people. If one of you were to raise your hand, your name will now go to the top of my list, and then I can watch for you. So Kelsey Metzger and Emily Bruce are now raising their hands and lowering them so that I can see that this dynamic happens. You guys may not be seeing their names move, but as a host, I can tell you that they just did that as a helpful reminder to me. Great. So, and before we go into the tools, I want to first think about what kinds of questions can work well for encouraging engagement. And this is beyond just Zoom, but also thinking about our in-person class. So when we think about active engagement, we want to think about questions, the ways in which we can use questions. I'm going to show you some questions that all are multiple choice, but are different types of questions as well. So some that can work well are, polling to generate or gauge their interest. So you might ask a question. Oops, I moved my slides, not your slides. Sorry. There we go. So you could ask a question like, what percentage of the American population has diabetes? And we could ask students to respond to this, to kind of generate, to gauge their interest, to understand, a quick check for understanding, maybe this was in the reading. We could also ask them to make a projection. So maybe instead we could ask them to predict what might happen. What percentage of Americans would you project to have diabetes by the year 2050 if the current trends hold? Maybe in your class, what's more relevant is whether or not they can make these kinds of projections or make different kinds of reasoning. You can also have them predict what might happen before you tell them what's about to happen. Similarly, so we could ask them kind of a true false kind of formative assessment, and we could ask them to generate how confident they are. So this might determine what kind of teaching or instruction you provide after the fact. So this particular question is about meiosis, and they can respond true with a high confidence, or true with a low confidence, or I really have no idea, not even a low confidence guess. Our biologist in the room, I know Kelsey is a biologist, says it's false, false, with high confidence, I can tell. I miss the laughing in Zoom. The muting is nice because we don't all, but I usually have jokes in my teaching, and it's tough to read the room. Similarly, you could have people do an analysis where this isn't a question, this particular one in the first 4 lines of this sonnet, they use this as a metaphor for what. This kind of question isn't one that they might respond to immediately. This is one, take a minute, think about it. And then give them time. You might play music during that time where everybody thinks for a minute. And then when you're ready, have them vote. So don't force a response right away, but instead take time, wait, and then ask for the answer. Sorry, the clicking from my screen to Sarah's is a little bit slow. Similarly, you could ask them to review, kind of doing a peer review of a question. So you could ask them, what's a good research question to focus on? Here's a couple of sentences to introduce this particular concept. Someone compared and contrasted these two ideas in their paper, and then give an excerpt, and then kind of ask them to critique it in different ways. Again, the polling can be a nice entry into that conversation, given what your goals are. Sorry, there's a lag here that's kind of funny. And so some of the tools to consider, and I am seeing, I think, some questions come up in the chat, and Sarah, maybe you can help me bring some of these forward. But that as you're asking these questions, you could ask students to respond using the chat, but then you end up with the first responder being the most excited responder. So depending on what type of question, that may or may not work as well. Other tools that can work are if you already use some kind of polling app that you like, either Chime In, which is a U of M tool, maybe you use Kahoot, maybe you have iClickers or Poll Everywhere, or one of these tools. I'm actually going to be pretty agnostic about them, but that you can still use those. I talked with a number of instructors this spring who continued to use Chime In for their questions because they found them easier to set up and create than the polling native to Zoom. And so I'd consider Chime In is free. These other ones are varying versions of it, but I've seen people successfully integrate these kinds of things into their chat. Again, consider how many of these things you're going to be using so that students get used to how your class works. So if you probably don't want 5 of these in a single class session. You want to pick a couple that are consistent in their use in your class. Similarly, we can use Zoom polls. I'm going to do a poll in just a few minutes. And maybe Sarah, while I'm doing that, can put a link to the IT or link to the Zoom help about knowledge base on how to set those polls up. The polls have to be set up usually prior to the class. So I had to go into this Zoom session, create the poll there. It's a little clunky, but you'll see that it's really nice because it'll be integrated into our session here. But here's another really cheater way to have students vote. And I've been using this in webinars since probably for the last 6 months, and it works actually pretty well. You can tell students to have their participants panel open and then use the reaction buttons as 4 options. So I can say, instead of saying that they're yes and no and go faster, go slower, I say, if you think it's this, press the yes button. If you think it's this, press the no button. If you think it's this, press the go faster, press the slower. And the reason that that's really helpful for me as the host and instructor is that when you guys click on those buttons, the number of people who've clicked each button shows up in my participants panel. So I can quickly see, for example, maybe 12 people clicked yes, 20 people clicked go slower, and then I can clear them all and start again. And those quick votes are really easy and don't require setting up any polling. You just have to teach them what the different options are in order to start it. And similar, yep, Jonathan, you could have them respond through Canvas using a quiz function. That's right, you could have Canvas and Zoom open and be going back and forth. Again, the key is that students know where the resources are for participating in the class and that they're in a consistent location and in a consistent mode for each class so that they're not scrambling to find different things. And then here's my big advice, and then I want to go to Sarah to see if there's any questions that I kind of missed and see if there's some new questions. After you do questions like this, where you maybe spur interest through the polling, don't skip the debrief. This is where the learning moment happens. We often think most about that we are testing and then we should just give them the correct answer. But that moment right before you weigh in is one of the most powerful learning moments about using questions or using polling in your class. And there's some powerful questions that can be used to spur discussion here. For example, can someone who voted B share their thinking? So now you're not, or share their reasoning. You could get someone to raise their hand. You could have them put it in the chat. But it's kind of this idea where you can expose thinking along lines of popular answers or common misconceptions. Similarly, this style of question can really lower the stakes to a student wanting to participate. So often students are nervous if they think their answer is wrong to say why they thought their answer. But if you say instead, why might a reasonable person think A is the correct answer? It invites the person who maybe incorrectly chose A and a person who maybe correctly didn't choose A, but understands why A is a reasonable answer. And so if you're trying to expose student thinking and help surface those kinds of misconceptions, these kinds of questions can really help. Or if you're trying to have people think about an experience that is not their own, you can say, why might someone believe X, Y, and Z? And it allows folks of different identities to maybe consider perspectives that are not their own. And then finally, sometimes this can be really nice to say, hey, Kelsey, I'm seeing you say this in the chat. Could you unmute yourself and say more about that? And so if you see kind of the start of a good answer or one that you'd like to spur more conversation about, inviting them to move from the chat into the space. Whereas the chat is often a low bar place to kind of maybe test something out, and speaking in class may be more nerve-wracking. What other kinds of questions or comments or ideas do you all have? And feel free to either put them in the chat or just raise your hand. Emily, go ahead.
I have a question. I really loved what you just walked through, Chris, about how much the debrief after a simple multiple choice question could open up. Because when you first started giving the examples, I was feeling skeptical that I don't use many multiple choice questions in my history courses, but these would totally work for my classes. This was great. But something I miss from face-to-face classrooms is the ability to ask a question and receive multiple answers at the same time from students. So something like, was this something you all understood? Do you want me to slow down and back up for this? Or, you know, how many of you quickly thought this, instead of having to set up a poll ahead of time or use a separate tool outside of Zoom? Now, I guess with some of those, your tip about using the buttons or raising hands could work, the reactions. But are there any ways to do that kind of, when you mass unmute, we can't hear each other, understand each other clearly? Thoughts about that kind of situation?
I'll pose a couple, but I bet some folks in the room also have some ideas. I think the reaction buttons can be really powerful there. So if we're good, say go faster. If you'd like more time, if you'd like me to go back, say go slower. Or similarly, asking folks to, as much as they're comfortable with, have their videos on and be nodding and say that you're like, give me a thumbs up. If you have fewer than, you know, will fit in your Brady Bunch of view where you're not in a couple of pages, that can be really helpful. But yeah, kind of those, I'm getting a thumbs up from Sarah Shane. I'm even seeing it, but I can only see 5 of you across the top. So the rest of you are unknowns to me, but I can see you and I see that you're there. And then there's a couple of this one. Kate says, I ask students to respond to open-ended questions in the chat and then follow up with specific students. So you could ask for some quick responses.
Chris, we're also getting questions that are coming in about, and I've been hearing this more and more about sort of forcing students to turn on Zoom, their videos, and we'll see that the majority of people in this session right now don't have their video on. And when we get into a moment a little bit later on, we're going to do a small group. I'm going to strongly encourage people to turn on their videos, because it helps the participant or the facilitators feel a little bit more like that there's this sort of teaching to some people. But I also want to strongly encourage people to not feel like they need to force that, because how students engage is going to be different for everyone. We know people with bandwidth problems, if they turn on the video, it sometimes kicks them out of Zoom. And so there's some real issues of why people aren't necessarily doing that. They don't want people to see the setting that they're in. They've got a ton of people in the background, their background, they can't put on a background. You know, there's multiple reasons of why people may not turn on their videos. But I think part of it is, if you're trying to build community over time, that you may need to start small. You know, understand that they're more likely to do that if they're in a small group. There's also the aspect that we're recording right now, and sometimes people don't want to be a part of the recording feature. And if you're recording things so students can access it later that can't show up, there's all kinds of things that may play into why students aren't engaging with their videos. And that's something to definitely work out with your class and have conversations about.
And I think it's about also setting culture and deciding what you want that culture to be. Both requiring and encouraging are different and feel different. And of course there's power in that, but allowing students to just say, we recognize not everyone is in, you know, a good situation, but we want to be in community together. Let's talk about how we might create that community, and then talk about what you want to do about video. Maybe allow some space for students to anonymously contribute to how they feel about those different things, centered around a conversation of how you want to be in community with one another. So setting those kinds of norms, but also having that be just like in your in-person class, having that conversation. Don't skip out on it just because it's a little bit more awkward in this online space. And I am now also seeing in the chat, monitoring the chat and doing presentation is cognitively quite demanding. I really like having a co-presenter who I can ask, and I know a number of folks who do what I saw a comment scroll by with, which is ask a student to monitor it. And then, like you saw me doing with Sarah, where I said, Sarah, am I missing anything in that chat? Like, I knew that it was scrolling, and I was like, I'm not catching, there's too many comments now. And so I asked Sarah, is there anything in there that you'd like to bring to my attention?
That being said, being the monitor and doing other things also can be hard to follow the chat as well. And so having multiple students out there to help you out could be a good thing too.
Perfect. We're going to show you a couple of more things, and they're really tied into the last bit. So I don't know that I have that much to add, but I do want to show you a poll. So we'll do that. before we jump into small groups, this lag from the remote is so funny. So talking a little bit about encouraging student participation, we've already been talking about this. I don't think I have that much to add here that we haven't already discussed, so I'll move quickly. But first I'll ask a poll, which is, I'm gonna launch a poll that I wrote prior to the start of this session. And so now you all can vote.
Chris, I think one of the things that's happening with the lag is that when I move my mouse to go to the chat, I might take over for you. And if I was trying to look something up, I didn't know if I was taking over from you. So clearly we have a little bit more to practice with this.
That's correct. Awesome. So as you guys are doing this, I'll tell you a little bit about what this looks like on my end. I'm actually actively seeing your responses change. It's telling me how many people have participated, and the bars of the response levels are showing. So currently I've got 46 out of the 52 people in this session have already voted. I'm going to close the voting. You could, just like with any kind of voting with students, you could tell them I'm going to give you a few minutes more. And then when I end the poll, it's showing me the responses and asking me if I want to share them with you. So you can close a poll in Zoom, and now I can share these results with you and we can both look at them, which is that, not surprisingly, most of you either weren't happy with the level of student participation when you pivoted or haven't pivoted, which I think makes sense, right? We're in a, if you were really happy with it, I'm really excited to have you here, but you should also share what you know. And then it was also interesting to kind of ask folks in what ways they had students participate during that time. And what I also want to note here, and that you may have already noted, is that Sarah and I are using really distinct slides when we're going to ask for your participation. And so you'll see that this one has a polling icon on it. It looks different than the rest of our slides. It's a marker both to us and to you that we have an engagement activity. And then what you would see if you log into our slide deck is that on most of these slides, we also have specifically scripted instructions for what we want to say to you about how to engage with those activities, so that we don't forget the instructions that we mean to provide to you. So I really encourage having prompts and posts on your slides as well. So we already talked about a lot of these, and I'd really welcome what helped those folks who it went really well, what they were doing that helped. And then first is choose the modes of participation that work for you. So if one is feeling really overwhelming or it's really unfamiliar, maybe that's not the mode you start with. Again, start with a couple that really make sense to you, that are high value for what you really want to maintain about your community, and maybe that what you miss about your in-person classes, as ways to spur discussion and how to break it up. And then intentionally plan for questions and comments. I think we often get away with a little bit more in smaller classes, and particularly in person, those on-the-fly questions. And if we intentionally plan for when we want to have questions, when we want to stop, when we want to have students think, then their participation is often richer because we've thought through a little bit more some of the sequences of questions that we might want to ask. I always encourage faculty and instructors to write down their questions. And then after the session, make a note about which questions bombed, which questions needed a tweak, which questions you want to use again. Otherwise, what I tend to find is that people repeat and use questions for discussion that you don't remember what happened 6 months ago, and then COVID happens, then you really don't remember what happened 6 months ago, and so you really need those notes that you created for yourself. And then coordinate with your teaching team. If you have a TA or another person who can come and help you with chat monitoring, or talk with them and coordinate with them about which roles you want each of them to play. Do you want to be monitoring the chat? Do you want to be monitoring for raising hands, or do you want them to manage that? Again, the size of your class is really going to matter. And of course, communicate how you want students to use the tools. So at the beginning of this session, we reminded you to put things in the chat to raise your hand. If you want different norms, that's fine, but remind them of what their norms are. Remind them of the norms they either decided on or that you would like to kind of encourage in your class. Great, and then Mark Jensen adds in the chat that he used a sheet with student names on it and checked off who spoke in class one day and the next period called on ones who hadn't spoken the prior class period. So made a point to kind of do some of that calling after they've thought of, and I know Mark, and usually Mark in your questions, you ask a question, allow them to think, and then call to allow, to lower that as well. Great. And then because no one's teaching super large classes, I'm going to skip talking about the Zoom. Oh, sorry. This is the last. Allow adequate wait time. Just like in your in-person classes, you actually have to really wait, especially if it's chat. By the time they've thought of it and then they're typing it and they have to have the whole thing composed before you even see that they have an answer, that can be really helpful. Or you just need to wait. I have had some instructors tell students, click the raise hand button if you're typing so that I know you're typing. And then when you're done, just lower it so that they knew to wait for the chat function. So you could, again, kind of reinforce those types of norms, give the just-in-time instructions for those kinds of things. Great. And then I will defer you to the slide deck if you're interested in understanding a webinar, which is a totally different, but for the kinds of courses you all described where you really want to develop a sense of community and sense of each other being in the class, this is not an appropriate like set of settings, but if you have a really big class, it could be. So there's a link in the speaker notes for that if you're interested. But I want to go switched over to Sarah. But you got to unmute.
Yes, I'm trying to unmute and take over from Chris. My mouse kept popping around there. Okay, fantastic. Here we are. So let's talk a little bit about fostering small group work inside of Zoom when you're doing Zoom meetings. And so obviously this is one of the ways to encourage interactions. While this can be done obviously in a large group setting, you know, when you're face-to-face, this can also be done here. And so some of the things that you're going to be thinking about, you know, are size of groups, what you're having them do, et cetera, et cetera. So before we actually get into the details of those things, we're going to have you experience this. And this is where I'm going to strongly encourage those of you that don't have your video on when we get into breakout rooms to turn on your video so you can chit-chat face-to-face if you're able to. Obviously, if you're going to get kicked out or whatever, we don't want you doing that. But I have set up breakout rooms to be small, so you have a chance to really get to know each other, or you know, everyone. It's small in part so everyone can participate. You know, if you have groups of 6 or 7, you may have most people participate. Not everybody. You could have 8 to 10, and you're going to have less and less. So the larger you make the groups, the less likely it is that people are going to participate. So let's get into the breakout directions here. One of the key things when you're doing breakouts is to make sure that you give clear instructions to students. So one of the things here is that when we open the breakout rooms, you can agree to join them. So there's going to be a little pop-up that comes up that says agree to join. And then you have a certain amount of time to get into your session. You can also create it in such a way that it automatically sends people off to those groups. So the larger the group, I would suggest doing that. There is a ask for help. So when you get into there, you're going to see very similar controls in your screen, and there is an ask for help, which means that I get a pop-up as the host that says, hey, group such and such is asking for help, and I can pop into your group and talk to you for that. So feel free to do that if you need to. 4 minutes to save the world is where we are right now. Yeah, we're going to give you 4 minutes in this. I think we've got time to do that. For the prompts. And the prompts for what you're going to be answering are in the Jamboard. And you may ask, Jamboard, what's a Jamboard? A Jamboard is one of those here, we're getting outside of Zoom. I'm going to try to do something sort of similar to the whiteboard. And so there are instructions inside the Jamboard. Chris just added the link to this Jamboard inside the chat. So if you click on that link, it should pop up. But basically what a Jamboard is, I can show you here too. You can probably also hear all the cars above me right now, for those that were here earlier, knowing that the Hot Wheel cars are going on. A Jamboard is a little bit like oh, I see many people are in there already, yay. It's similar to almost a Google presentation, but it's got sticky notes. So up at the top, oh, someone's moving mine around already, messing with me. At the top, there are different frames, as they call it, and to contribute, your controls are over on the left-hand side here. And so you're gonna be moving to frame 2, which is where your instructions are gonna be for this. So if I go back to our presentation, basically as a group, you're introducing yourself to each other, and then you're deciding as a group on a color that would represent how you feel about engaging with students in Zoom. It does not need to be a color of the sticky board that's out there. Oh, great. And too many people. We're learning things about Jamboard already right now.
I'll take a second or third. You keep going, Sarah.
Okay. So I'm going to just send you off into groups, and then hopefully one person in each group can get into the Jamboard and make some things with that, is what I think we should do. How do you feel about that, Chris, if I send people off and see how that works?
Yep, so there's too many people in there, but I think for the number of groups we'll have, it'll be fine if you just designate one person to open it up, and then we can solve the capacity problem by people kind of checking it out after the fact, and we'll learn what that, we have not maxed it out before. So we've learned something, and I'm gonna find out exactly what that max is while you're in your groups.
Yep, and if it's all just people going there at once, or are you able to now? Chris, I also can't find you in the breakout rooms to move you back here. But I'm going to open up the rooms, and actually it's going to automatically send you out there. Okay, everybody ready? Here we go. Oh, Chris, did you leave and come back? Or you're muted though?
Oh yeah, I just popped out. And then I'm just gonna
What group were you another minute, which I actually thought I could immediately bring you back, but or the 4 minutes would be part of that. So you actually had 5 minutes. Some of you chose to come back earlier, and some of you were forced to come back. Most of the time when you move between the two, it mutes you automatically. So if you were talking and you keep on talking, you don't end up talking when you come back to this session. So let's do a little debrief on this. Can you still see my screen here? Chris, you're still seeing the screen? I'm still sharing?
You're still perfect.
Okay. So hopefully when you were in there, you saw that you could screen share if you wanted to, depending on what you did. So a debrief, a few things that I want to ask. So feel free to raise your hand on this or put it in the chat, but how was it getting into the breakout rooms? How was it getting started in the breakout rooms? How was it finding and using the Jamboard? We did learn that you can only have 50 people in a Jamboard at once, so apologies about that. Were the directions clear? What about the timing? Was 4 minutes too long or too short? So, is anybody willing to raise their hand and share with us?
Or share questions that you had about these kinds of activities. First of all, your colors are wonderful, from opaque purple to Tiffany blue to purple gray and undecided. So thank you for engaging. What are the questions?
Kelsey, I see a hand. Oh, 2 hands, yeah. Kelsey, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have heard that you can assign the groups for breakout rooms ahead of time. And so I'm wondering about setting up consistent teams throughout the semester. How easy is that to facilitate? Yeah, so just tell me a little bit more about setting up the teams or groups.
Ooh, happy to. Can we do it? I want to do a little debrief on that, and Kelsey, we'll get to that question at the end because it does require a little bit of setup with that. Tammy, I think I saw your hand raised there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we did really well in our group. We were all very interested in aesthetics, apparently. It was a pretty good conversation about blue, but then our tile didn't end up blue. It's the one that doesn't have a color behind it. And it did have a color in our breakout room. So I just wanted, I just wondered if, if we made a mistake, or if or if it just didn't transfer back out.
No, I ended up setting it to a clear background. Sorry.
Oh, you did? Oh, that's okay, Kelsey. Anyway, that was fun, and I can see lots of applications for interactive language teaching on Jamboard with sticky notes.
One of the things too, just like when you get students into small groups and you're in person, allow enough time for them to introduce themselves. 4 minutes is entirely too short for a first time activity with people you don't know. You did not probably introduce yourself, or you introduced yourself and didn't do our task. So keeping in mind timing, and you can pop into a group and see how they're doing and see what the conversation's like and pop back out.
And Catherine, I see your hand up there too. Do you like to share?
Yes, that was my comment that Chris just made, is that 4 minutes was way too short to just kind of feel like, here, do something and then get it done, and without a little bit more either, so I'm thinking in the class, like you've been in a group before and you're ready to just launch in to an activity or to have an introductory type of activity, and then later you do something else. So.
Yes, that was semi-intentional, partly an hour to do, and partly because we want you to experience that rush, and that there should be something, a little bit of moving students forward, but allowing some time for them, especially their first few times, if they're introducing, getting to know each other. I think I saw something Emily put in the chat of have students when they first come into the group, type in their name, hello, something that they have to do as a chat, and that establishes the order of who's going to be talking when. Of course, then if they know that, they may have nobody typed anything in because nobody wants to go first, but you can deal with that. Anybody else want to share a quick debrief? Kelsey,
go ahead. I was going to return to Kelsey, and it came up in the chat from, I think Ali is how we pronounce that. And do you want me to field it? Or the short answer is you can pre-assign groups. The key to it is that when the person logs in, they need to be logged into Zoom. And otherwise, when you go to put them in the groups, you've got your pre-assigned list that is based on their email addresses, their internet ID, and then it goes to put someone in. And if they're not logged in, there's no match between the people. And so the breakout rooms don't work. And so what you really need to do is really strongly encourage and kind of train your students to make sure that they go to zoom.umn.edu, click that login button before they log into your class. Because if they don't, that setting up of the groups, and that's what caused a lot of trouble for a number of folks this spring, and particularly with the quick switch, there was a lot of chaoticness, and so I think it was unclear for many what was going on, but that's the trick of getting that to work. And then one other question that's coming up is kind of differences between whiteboards and Jamboards. And whiteboard is something that's native to Zoom. It's going to be ephemeral, so it'll pass, right? So as soon as I had Sarah save that whiteboard right when we did it, because otherwise it goes away. This Jamboard will live on. You could have this be an activity that they do before or after class, and then you return to in class. Similarly, all of your students could log into that Jamboard. It needs to be in a separate window from Zoom, so they're navigating 2 windows. So if someone in your breakout was sharing their screen to show the Jamboard, only that person could be altering it or things like that. So that's kind of some things to consider as you decide. But one of the things I do want to highlight that Sarah did a really nice job in setting up this Jamboard was having all the instructions for the activity in one place where you can access them and don't need to ask us what the instructions were. So they were all in that Jamboard for you.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving here. One of the, my high ideal was to have you try out another tool, the Chime In, to sort of show, to ask questions of sort of what tips have you learned along the way here. Instead, just you can feel free to add those in the chat if you want to. I'm not going to use a Chime In just for the interest of time and finding the Chime In and sharing all that, because I do have some screenshots of what can happen. But just consideration tips as you're going through and putting things together. Make sure your directions are clear and explicit. As Chris just said, that was specifically put in the Jamboard so students didn't have to, if we shared the screen in Zoom, when you go into your breakouts, you don't see my screen anymore. Right, and so students need access to what they're being asked to do. It's either very simple, or it's if there's details, they have a Google Doc, a Jamboard, something like that they can get to. So make sure the technology and the tasks are clear of what they're going to do. I know we've been having questions about people were sharing their screen at the Jamboard, and no one would be able to contribute to that because they're just sharing their screen. It's not the whiteboard in Zoom, as Chris has also just mentioned. So start with something low stakes. Don't make it super meaningful. You made the coach your groups and how to do interactions, who's getting started, how to popcorn around. So once one person's done, then they can say the name of the next person that's to their right or something like that, and how to keep things moving within small groups. Add new technology as time goes on. Don't try to do what we're doing and throw Chime In and Zoom and Jamboard in all at once, but we were throwing that out to you to start them off slowly. Size of groups is going to be considerate. If you want everybody talking, make it smaller. If you're okay with a few people talking and some people sort of sitting back, you can make that smaller, bigger, you know, so 3 to 4 to 6 to 7 to 10, etc. Timing is going to be iterative. You're going to be figuring that out. That it does 4 minutes was very quick, whereas, you know, sometimes in a face-to-face class, 4 minutes can be a long time. And again, allow time for the debrief. You've heard us say this before, and we're saying it again. So capturing student work, one of the things we wanted to mention is that with the group work and what you're trying to do here, when you're capturing student work, there's a couple different ways of thinking about it. One is sometimes you just want to do attendance. If you just want to do attendance, this is your way of showing attendance. You could do a Chime In. You could make students log in. It could be connected to Canvas. You can know all of that. So what I'm showing here is something I did that was actually more faculty development, but it was a quick screenshot I could give you of this is one thing you can do in Chime In where it just gives you, you know, sort of a layout of how people have answered, how they use Canvas. But this is also Chime In where you can do a word cloud. Chime In 2 has now created some new things that you can do. You can also share images and have that happen asynchronously. And then other ways that you're going to interact with students is not just the attendance, but sort of real-time understanding, right? You can do that with Chime In. You can do that with polls. You can do that a few different ways of sort of that real-time check-in. Do they understand what's going on? Google Docs can even do it for you, or Google Presentations. And then there's the aspect of peer learning, where you're wanting them to learn from one another. And so that's sort of the idea of the Jamboard, you know, putting everything together where you can see what they're doing and what they're talking about. If they're producing something, it could be a Google Doc or a Google presentation there too. So got that all in here written out as well. And this is where we have a minute left for questions or other final thoughts that people want to say.
Hey, Sarah, why don't we go to our final thoughts? We'll stick around for questions. I want to make sure that also in the chat you're finding an eval. So kind of, if you haven't heard us say this, basically be explicit about how and when you want students to engage. Start simple and add more tools. And don't forget the debrief, I think might be the 3 most important things that we wanted to iterate. And before you go, please do give us some feedback on this workshop. We'll be doing it multiple times this summer, so definitely appreciate that feedback. The link is in the chat. I'll also put a link to the resource folder, and then we'll finish up by sticking around for questions and comments from folks about what we've been talking about. So feel free to raise your hand or dump it in the chat or just unmute yourself. So thanks so much for joining us.